In the previous presentation, we introduced this simple framework to describe the climate financing building blocks, which is an approach that CEADIR recommends for assessing institutional readiness to access climate financing. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about the financing building blocks in more detail and describe an approach to assessing the building blocks to help assess readiness to access adaptation financing for priority actions. So first, I'll start with an introduction to the climate financing building blocks, picking up from where we left off in the last presentation. We'll describe the purpose of this analysis and how it can help support strategic financing strategies for your national adaptation plans. And also, I'll walk through an example from Peru, where CEADIR has been doing a financing building blocks assessment to support adaptation financing readiness for the Peru National Adaptation Plan. So we saw this slide in the last presentation. So this slide shows this simple framework that CEADIR has developed to describe these financing building blocks and some of the different institutional conditions that can either support or enable the ability to access adaptation financing, or also present challenges to accessing adaptation financing. So the first building block, the enabling environment. This describes the environments for incentivizing investment around adaptation and some of the conditions associated with, for example, facilitating private sector investment in adaptation actions or working with local financial institutions to finance adaptation actions. The second building block, capacity and information, describes the information available about adaptation financing or about funding priority actions. It describes some of the capacity available in your institutions to develop the types of proposals that you'd have to submit to funders for adaptation financing. Finally, the third building block, financing mechanisms and instruments, describes the very specific, kind of the nuts and bolts about the mechanisms and instruments that any institution would be able to need to manage to be able to procure funding from lenders or donors, and also to manage those investments through your institutional mechanisms. So we'll talk about some specific financing mechanisms and some strategies also for facilitating access to some of these financial instruments and mechanisms. Now, in the next several slides, I want to just walk through an example from Peru's assessment of its financing building blocks. And so CEADIR has been working in Peru to support the financing strategy that will accompany the National Adaptation Plan in Peru. And I just want to note that these are just a few examples of some of the considerations that could be components of your financing building blocks assessment. So these are not the only things that you would want to think about as you assess each building block, but these are just a couple examples, and we'll spend some more time in this workshop and in some of the following presentations describing some of the considerations in more detail around each building block and around conducting this assessment. But I want to show you just a couple examples from Peru to give you an understanding of what types of considerations are involved in assessing the building blocks. So starting with the enabling environment, a couple of the strengths in Peru's enabling environment for accessing adaptation financing include relatively large budgets for adaptation investments in priority sectors. Another example of a strength for accessing adaptation financing is that there's a lot of experience with public-private partnerships for implementing adaptation initiatives. There are a lot of private sector groups and entities that are active in Peru on many initiatives that contribute to meeting adaptation goals. And so there's a lot of experience in the country with managing these types of financing arrangements. So the enabling environment around that type of private sector investment is strong. An example of a limitation, though, in Peru's enabling environment is that national adaptation planning primarily occurs in only one agency. The Ministry of Environment is leading adaptation planning in the country, in Peru, to support the national adaptation planning process. But of course, CEADIR recommends that in a development-first approach, and a climate-resilient development approach, that countries should engage experts from multiple ministries, from multiple sectors to encourage investment and buy-in of adaptation actions, and so that the experts who will be in charge of managing adaptation investments and adaptation actions understand the goals and understand the needs associated with all of these adaptation programs and projects. So that's an important limitation to consider around the enabling environment. So the next building block that we'll talk about is this capacity and information building block. So the information that's available to support adaptation, financing planning, the capacity of staff, and we'll look at a couple more examples of some strengths and limitations that you could consider as you assess capacity and information building block in Senegal. So in Peru, one of the strengths of the capacity and information building block is that there's a lot of good information on climate vulnerabilities, adaptation needs, and potential financing sources. So it's a fairly data-rich environment. One of the limitations, though, is that there are limited project development skills at national, regional, and local levels. Developing complex proposals for adaptation financing requires highly trained and skilled staff. It requires a lot of data inputs. It requires technical writing skills, and most often these kinds of proposals have to be submitted in English. So these are challenges that institutions have to tackle if they're going to be able to prepare these types of complex funding proposals. Another limitation in Peru on the capacity and information building block is that domestic investment banks lack experience with financing adaptation and monitoring and evaluating adaptation investments. Because a lot of adaptation investments are relatively new and relatively unfamiliar to many local investors and potential partners at the local level, they often are hesitant to take the risks associated with adaptation investments because they're unfamiliar with some of the risk assessments involved in these types of investments. And so this can be an important limitation when there's not a lot of information about the risks associated with adaptation investments, and that can make potential partners a little hesitant to fund these types of actions. The last building block that we'll mention here is the financing mechanisms and instruments building block. And so this describes institutions' experience with various types of financing mechanisms and instruments and the ability to actually use these mechanisms and instruments and manage these investments through multiple types of mechanisms and instruments. It's helpful to think about both the public sector's ability to manage financing mechanisms and instruments and the private sector's ability. So I've broken these examples out into two slides. And on this slide, we see a few examples of the strengths and limitations of Peru's public sector in using and accessing these financing mechanisms and instruments. Some of the strengths of the public sector in Peru include a flexibility to transfer and redistribute national budget funds across entities at subnational level. So there's some flexibility in being able to move funding around to the most critical needs, and that creates some flexibility in being able to manage these investments to address priorities no matter where they might be in the country. Another strength includes the availability of incentives for the private sector to invest in public-private partnerships. And so, as I said earlier, you'll see that some of these examples can kind of overlap across different building blocks. But we saw that the public-private partnerships and that enabling environment came up earlier in the discussion of the enabling environment building block. But the public-private partnership, of course, is also a very specific financing mechanism. So considering the specific incentives involved for the private sector to be able to invest in this can also be a consideration under your financing mechanisms and instruments building block assessment. Another strength in Peru in the public sector is that the national budget is organized around problem areas that have direct links to climate change and adaptation needs. In other words, there are pools of funding for water projects or for agricultural projects or for transportation projects. And so that also provides flexibility to be able to direct adaptation funding toward the critical needs and to help maximize and mainstream some of these adaptation projects into existing funding streams that already go towards these critical problem areas. One of the limitations, though, in the public sector financing mechanisms and instruments building block is that local governments have limited capacity to supply co-financing. And co-financing is often a requirement for many of the major multilateral funds, whether those are grants or loans or other types of financing mechanisms and instruments. So this is certainly a common hurdle that many countries face in trying to enter into specific funding agreements, because there's often a requirement for co-financing. Now let's talk a little bit about the private sector and some of the strengths and limitations around the financing mechanisms and instruments building block in Peru. Some of the strengths of the private sector in Peru include a large number of private sector entities that are active on issues related to development, environment, and climate change. In Peru, there are many non-governmental organizations, other private sector groups who are very active on various conservation issues, natural resource management issues. And so these groups that often have a global presence have a lot of experience in managing these instruments. And so there's a lot of knowledge and skill already available in the country to take advantage of a diverse portfolio of financing mechanisms and instruments for funding adaptation. There's also extensive experience accessing funding from international financing sources. Because these groups do operate at the global level, they're very familiar with some of the major multilateral funds, and they have the administrative capacity for managing those funds fairly easily. One of the limitations, though, of the private sector and the financing mechanisms and instruments building blocks is that there are limited sources for small agricultural businesses with weak credit worthiness. And so this is also a common limitation in many countries that have a strong agricultural sector and have a great economic dependence on agricultural production. It's difficult for farmers or other small agricultural operations to access credit that they might need to make investments in climate resilient agriculture, and that is certainly an important challenge for helping to spur some of those investments that would contribute to advancing adaptation in the agriculture sector. So in the next presentation, we'll talk more in detail about some of the specific options that a country has to address each of these building blocks through the institutions, and we'll talk more in depth about some activities that we'll do in this workshop to begin to do a preliminary assessment of Senegal's adaptation financing building blocks.